Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Shaw.
Mrs. Willbrand.
Coming back at you, this time on the origins of the Cold War. And it's going to be a doozy.
Sounds like fun.
Let's get to it. Oh, man, it always does that. All right, now I look like an idiot. Okay, sorry, moving on. All right, so former allies clash again. The United States and the Soviet Union they emerged from World War II as superpowers. Most of Europe was devastated militarily, economically, because that's where most of the fighting occurred. And so, as I said, the U.S. and Soviet Union were the ones that were kind of on top, and they're very different. The politically and economically are the main ways that they're different. They're really on opposite sides of the political spectrum, where you see like democracy in the United States versus a dictatorship in the Soviet Union. And then they're on opposite side of the economic spectrum, where U.S. using capitalism, private businesses, free enterprise, things like that. And then the USSR using communism and government control of pretty much everything, and redistribution of wealth and things like that.
Yep. All right, so let's talk about some reasons why the U.S. and the Soviet Union are not friends, especially coming out of World War II. During World War II, Stalin had allied with Hitler briefly, right, until the whole Poland thing, and then things got a little shady. The U.S. did keep the development of the atomic bomb a secret, which Stalin did not appreciate at all. Like, how could you keep that from us? It's a big deal. And then Stalin refused to allow democracy in Poland and other parts of Eastern Europe. We're going to hit that a little bit harder here in a couple of slides when we talk about the satellite countries. And at the Yalta Conference, Stalin had agreed to allow free elections, especially in those nations. But then after the war, he bans democratic parties in countries under the Soviet Union control. He also says that he's going to allow free elections in the Soviet Union, and he does, but he bans all other parties except for himself. So, democracy.
Convenient democracy.
Yeah.
All right, so again, and in general, these tensions are going to just be building and building and building. Again, the United States are going to be fearful of communism, and really, I would think that, in general, Stalin and his group of supporters are going to be really fearful of the United States and capitalism and democracy too, because it will basically end their rule in the Soviet Union. So what the Soviet Union is going to do is instead of allowing for more freedom, they're actually going to kind of restrict. They're going to take the opposite approach. Instead of allowing democracy, they're going to tighten their grip on Eastern Europe. They had suffered really heavy losses in World War II, but again, they have the most people as well. So they kind of justify this. I guess what they're doing, like taking over other countries and creating these satellite nations, as Ms. Willbrand mentioned, because of the losses that they suffered during World War II. In all of these different countries that you see here, they established communist governments, again, pretty much against the will of the people, and not that and I guess some of them might have wanted it. We don't really know, but they just kind of established the communist government anyway, and that's when they became satellite nations and kind of were incorporated into the Soviet Union. And these are countries that are dependent upon and dominated by Soviets. Tensions are going to mount again as think of communism spreading, and it's really easily kind of divided over here. You can see in the West we have a lot of democracies, and in the East we have a lot of communists. And so that's what Winston Churchill in a 1946 speech that he actually gave in Fulton, Missouri. He called it the Iron Curtain speech, and he said an Iron Curtain has descended upon Europe, and if the United States and the other democratic allies did not do anything about it, basically that would allow the USSR and the Soviet Union to kind of tighten their control and eventually become a problem that was going to be really hard to deal with.
We're going to see the debate of the Cold War being communism versus capitalism, and we're going to come back to this time and time and time again. What's important to remember, especially when we talk about the spread of communism and the push of capitalism into Europe, that both sides think they're right. They both think that's what's best for them, their countries, and their people. So, all right, so the Cold War, and you need this definition because this is our unit from now through like the end of March.
The end of time.
And maybe beyond. All right, the Cold War. The Cold War was a conflict between the U.S. and the Soviet Union in which neither nation ever fired a weapon directly at each other. They never saw actual battle with each other in the forms of a war between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. They're going to fight little side battles where they're helping other countries, and they just happen to fight each other, but not ever actually fighting directly one another. That's why the war is cold, because the guns are cold. They never heat up. All right. The Cold War lasts from 1945 to 1991, so we're just straight into it out of World War II, because communism. All right. The U.S. does establish a policy of containment. And containment is the policy of preventing the spread of communism. So we're going to see this policy include diplomatic outreach, helping countries by making treaties with them and sending diplomats to help them, but also financial assistance, and then eventually some military assistance as well. When diplomatic outreach and financial assistance isn't quite enough, we're going to send some help. Okay. It does place the U.S. in direct opposition with the Soviet Union. So this policy of containment is the U.S.'s way of saying, this is not okay. We're going to stop you. And then the Soviet Union being like, well, that's not nice. It's on.
It kind of goes back to imperialism a little bit. Like,
Yeah.
it's like not obviously not the same, but similar in a way that, you know, America wants to spread democracy, the USSR wants to spread communism, and both of them kind of had a policy of containment. The Soviet Union also did not want democracy to spread because that would be more allies for the United States and, you know, less potential allies or resources for them.
The goal is for capitalism to take over the whole world, or communism to take over the whole world. So,
And there's really they don't really work well together.
no.
Although maybe they could have. There's a lot of just misunderstanding.
Maybe on paper.
Maybe. Who knows? All right, so the United States, in kind of response to the Cold War starting, is going to kind of create a shuffling of government agencies. Again, we're going to need a lot more like intelligence agencies to really deal with the more complex foreign relations that is created by the Cold War. You know, things like the CIA, the National Security Agency, like all of these are going to be developed to really like gather intelligence and gather information about other nations to make sure that we are, you know, not our safety and we are not threatened by these other nations. Again, and that's what the other thing they're going to do too is that remember, like we're going to get to this when we talk about the Cold War at home, but again, Americans really don't like communism, or at least I mean they didn't and still don't even to this day in a lot of cases. So these agencies are tracking communist activity abroad and at home, and that is going to lead to you know some more violations of rights. Again, 1947. Again, this is just kind of a list of what they created. He signs the National Security Act. This is going to create the National Security Council, focusing on national security concerns. The CIA, as I mentioned, which is going to gather intelligence, which is just a fancy word for information from the military and the State Department. They're going to perform covert operations in foreign country. Again, think James Bond, except for the United States.
Sneaky, sneaky.
And he's also going to reorganize the military. He's going to create the Department of Defense. Again, before that, it was always called the Department of War. And then again, he's going to kind of, and then I guess it was they had the Department of like the Navy and like all of those
Air
as
Force.
well.
It was the Department of Air Force, Navy, and War, and they combined them all into the Department of Defense.
I was going to get there.
I'm sorry.
Gosh.
Also, you need the CIA. Make sure that's in your notes.
Oh, I forgot to bold that. I'm so sorry.
It's okay.
You
We'll
deserve
do it after this. All right, so let's talk some of these policies to help with containment. First up, the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine, because Britain can't do it, is going to replace the aid to Greece and Turkey because they're really pretty close to the Soviet Union and those satellite nations, and everybody hurts after World War II. So we're going to... They do.
Sorry, I was thinking of the song. Everybody hurts. Sorry, continue.
It's our Cold War theme song now. So we're going to give them some aid, specifically Greece and Turkey when we're talking about the Truman Doctrine. And then the definition is right there for you. On the flip side, we have the Marshall Plan, which is post-war Western Europe help for all of Western Europe. Because, again, Europe is devastated. Things have been destroyed. Nobody has any money. They all need help. And when everyone's broke, you're more likely to seek help from other people. And who's going to swoop in and try to help them? The Soviet Union. So we have to get to them first with some economic aid. And so that's what the Marshall Plan is going to do. It revives 16 nations, and it does offer aid to the Soviet Union and its allies. Of course, the Soviets refuse help because capitalism is terrible. The aid does help rebuild Western Europe and helps our relations with those countries as well.
Again, and these are just kind of one after the other. So Truman Doctrine kind of starts out just focusing on Greece and Turkey, and they're specifically dealing with communist threats there. Okay, and then the Marshall Plan expands the scope, and they're going to be dealing with just any country that needs to rebuild. And as Ms. Willbrand said, that we're hoping that if they rebuild and they are stable, then they won't fall to communist threats from outside forces. Okay, so this really comes to a head in Germany. So what you need to understand is at Yalta, the U.S. and the USSR, they really clash over German reunification. So they decide to split it up into 4 zones, as we talked about at the end of the last unit. So again, Great Britain, France, the United States, and Soviet Union all have a piece of Germany. The British, the French, and the U.S. all decide to combine their zones because they're all democratic and they're all being run pretty much the same, and they thought it would be easier to just combine them. So they create what's known as West Germany and West Berlin, and that was one thing that I forgot to mention. They also divided up Berlin as well. So the capital of Germany and Germany itself were all divided into 4 different zones.
A lot of Germany is farmland at this point, and so Berlin is really the economic hub of Germany, so they divide Berlin as well, because money is power, so they divide up that power as well.
You should know, and again, we'll show you what this looks like in class, but like West Berlin is going to be in the Soviet portion of Eastern Germany. So we have a little tiny piece that is owned quote unquote by the Democratic side, and that's going to be surrounded by communist territory. So in 1948, in response to the Democratic nations combining their territory, Stalin is going to close all access to West Berlin, and the West Berliners only had enough food. Berliners? Seems good. They only have enough food and fuel for about 5 weeks. Now remember that the United States, Great Britain, and France are in charge of these of West Berlin as well, and they're in charge of providing for them. So they start the Berlin airlift, which is going to Britain and the United States are going to fly food and supplies into West Berlin. And again, it's very expensive. I think it costs something like $1 million a day to do this. But again, you have to provide for those people, and Stalin is not making that very easy right now. The airlift the blockade rather, made Stalin look really, really bad because he was basically just leaving these people to starve. And so he lifts the blockade in 1949, and then we kind of have our boundaries in Germany. Now we have the Federal Republic of Germany, which is West Germany, including West Berlin, and then the German Democratic Republic, which is East Germany, including East Berlin, are formed. Again, you'll notice the names. The names here are really funny because, again, the German Democratic Republic was actually controlled by communist Soviet Union. Anything to add there?
No.
They flew chocolate to the kids.
So nice.
I know, right? Gosh.
All right. My grandma actually received some of that chocolate.
No kidding.
Mm-hmm. So anyway.
Look at that.
Fun stuff. Anywho, NATO. So, since we're having so much fun, let's talk about NATO. So with the fear of Soviet aggression looming above us, it leads to the creation of NATO, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. You need this in your notes. Right. The European nations, U.S., Canada, they all pledge mutual military support to each other. Peacetime military alliance and the Cold War end the policy of U.S. isolationism, because now we can't stay by ourselves because now we're in a treaty, like a pact. And then the Soviet Union, in response, forms the Warsaw Pact, and they form this with the communist countries in Eastern Europe, which they pretty much turned communist themselves, so it's really just a pact with themselves and their children. But it's all right. Yeah.
Let's heat things up.
Let's go. Let's go to China.
Okay, so China is going to, again, we remember the policy of containment. That's the biggest thing that we're dealing with here. China is going to become a communist country. It is the second country now to become communist, and this is going to be a really big deal. Again, China itself, it's a very interesting story. We don't have a whole lot of time to get into it. We have a lot of specifics here for you, but just so you, there was a civil war happening in China between the nationalist government and like Mao Zedong and the communists, and this was kind of raging for a number of years, but eventually the communists are going to win. And again, I don't really know how much I even need you guys to understand about all of this other stuff, to be honest with you. I would just say you need to know that it fell and then became communist.
Yeah, and I think like the biggest part of this is that China is a huge nation, and so when the Communist Party is able to push the nationalists, who, by the way, are not that great and are super corrupt, so I'll let you take that for what it is. When they're able to push them all the way out and into Taiwan, the rest of the capitalist world gets very concerned. So the U.S., Britain, pretty much Western Europe, very concerned about how easy it was for Mao to take over a huge nation like China and convince these people that communism was the answer for them. And initially, it kind of was, because they had nothing, the farmers, the peasants couldn't read. Well, you don't need to get into all of it. He does, initially help a lot of the people to win their support, and that's really concerning, because the last time we saw people really help or promise things to the people to win support, Hitler took power and built a strong military, and World War II happened. And so this fear of communism spreading is becoming more and more realistic.
But for and again, I just want to add, for the Chinese, though, this seemed like the best option.
Yeah.
And it not only seemed like it was a better option. Because the nationalist government was very corrupt, as Ms. Willbrand said. So again, in American minds, we might think, oh, why would they want to do this? But they also don't have a history of capitalism.
No.
We have a history of capitalism, and that's kind of why we, think the way that we do. But that's not shared by a lot of countries around the world, or not, at least not by every country around the world.
Again, we've already kind of touched on the nationalists going to Taiwan. Read it. It just furthers the story about China, but I don't think we need it right now.
Let's not worry about it.
Okay. And
I would probably have this.
Yeah, and kind of like I mentioned earlier, so the U.S. public is stunned by the communist takeover of China. Containment has failed us, even though the U.S. poured tons of money into helping the Nationalist Party. Again, mistake, they were super corrupt. But anyway.
But again, it was the opposite of communism.
Stop communism. Yeah. And so the U.S. is just shocked, how did we not do enough? Plus, we spent a bunch of money on it, right? Republicans and Democrats in Congress do blame Truman for this. Poor Truman. He just really gets blamed for a lot of things that kind of fell into his lap. For not sending enough aid, but they were mad when he was sending aid originally because they said it was too much aid, so Truman can do no right here. And then Truman, of course, blames the Nationalist Party for being corrupt. And then the conservatives do reject any excuses, and they claim the U.S. government is full of communist agents, and that's going to kick off some Red Scare stuff again. So, but we'll get into that later.
And it honestly is pretty much the exact same, as the 1920s. It's actually worse, but pretty much the same. Everything that you know about the 1920s Red Scare will help you with the 1950s Red Scare.
Remember this moment when we get into the next, teeny tiny part of this unit.
All right, let's talk about Korea. So again, lots of specifics here. I'm more worried about you understanding that, that Korea, especially if you look at the map here, Korea is the kind of the next step. We're going to learn about the domino theory later, and the domino theory is just that if once one country falls to communism, others around it will too. They'll fall like dominoes. So North Korea was already a communist, or was leaning communist as well after China became communist, and South Korea was democratic.
The story's so interesting of how it happened.
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, so Japan takes over Korea in 1910. Right, at the end of World War II, Japanese soldiers in North Korea surrender to the Soviet Union, because those are the soldiers that are in North Korea, and then the Japanese soldiers that were in South Korea surrendered to the U.S. And so then it effectively splits Korea because they accidentally surrendered to two very different countries. And then the Soviets in North Korea and the U.S. and South Korea couldn't agree on whether they should be capitalistic or communist. And cue the 38th parallel.
And again, the
It's so
38th parallel is really arbitrary. Like it doesn't really even have much of a reasoning. It was just happened to go straight through the middle of the country. So they decide, again, they're going to be dividing families, like land and like all kinds of stuff there too. You want me to keep going?
Keep
Okay,
going.
sure. So in 1948, the Republic of Korea and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea are founded. Seoul becomes the capital of South Korea. Pyongyang is the capital of North Korea. The leaders want to reunite because, again, this was also like outside forces. A lot of outside forces were basically divided up the country, but they really can't agree on the type of government. Again, North Korea wants the whole country to be communist. South Korea wants the whole country to be democratic.
Which really kind of kicks off the Korean War. So in 1950, the North Korea does invade South Korea, and that really begins the Korean War. South Korea calls on the United Nations to stop the invasion. The Security Council approves this, but the Soviet Union was still really mad over like China moving into Taiwan, the nationalists moving into Taiwan, and then the UN like not allowing him to take over Taiwan as well. And so they didn't show up to this UN meeting to vote. And so they voted to stop the spread of communism and help South Korea capitalists. And so then the USSR is upset because they're like, why are you helping the capitalists and not the communists? Like, what's going on? Well, you didn't show up. Okay? Anyway, Congress never declares war in Korea. The U.S. is involved as a part of police action through the UN, which means that we are going to send troops through the United Nations to help Korea because they're our friends, South Korea, because they're our friends. But we're not going to war. We're just helping police the event. Okay? Just there to help.
That is a vocab word?
It is a vocab word.
It's not bolded, but
we'll
you need to know
later, but you need to know it. Truman sends troops and a fleet in the water. He oversteps his powers as president a little bit. This is an ongoing debate. Still, like, did he like way overstep or just a little overstep? But either way, the president is not supposed to send troops without congressional approval, declaring war. But he did it. 16 nations send 520,000 troops to aid South Korea. 90% of those troops are American troops. Okay? And they add to the South Korean troops, which aren't that big at the time. Okay, MacArthur is put in command of South Korea, the U.S., and all of the UN forces. We'll talk more about MacArthur later.
He was very famous for operating the Pacific Theater, the war against Japan in World War II.
Yep.
All right, so again, like all of this, what I need you to understand about all of this, and you can write it if you want. My biggest concern is that you need to understand that, like, basically they were divided at the beginning. North Korea invaded South Korea, and again, they forced all of these troops basically almost all the way down to the bottom part of South Korea, the southern part of South Korea, and then MacArthur in 1950 is going to attack, push them all the way back to the north. He almost gets them to the 38th parallel, or almost gets them all the way back to the Chinese border.
Yeah.
China warns at this point, China is we don't want China to get involved, though.
Nope.
Like, if China gets involved, that's a big deal. That's another communist nation. Okay. If China gets involved, maybe the Soviet Union would get involved. It's like, we don't want any of that. So China warns UN forces to stay away from the Yalu River, which is the Chinese and Korean border. If they get involved, bad news for the United States, or at least that it would make the war worse. Like,
a lot of troops there.
Like, we could probably still be okay, but like, again, we're trying to avoid another all-out war. And remember, we're only 5 years away from World War II. Like, it hasn't even been that long, and we're already, back to fighting again. Mm-hmm. So again, in 1950, China does start sending troops to help North Korea. At that point, they push all the way south again. They capture Seoul, the capital of South Korea. Fighting continues for 2 more years. Again, it's basically just like a big seesaw.
Back and forth, back and forth. What's a big deal about MacArthur's attack in 1950 is when they push them all the way to the bottom part of South Korea, he stages a 2-front attack where he goes on one side and the other side, and that's what makes him so successful in in that attack and helps push them almost all the way into China.
And it was a big risk that he took there,
Yes,
too.
but it was really, really successful. He won the hearts of the American people when it happened, which we'll get into a little bit more later. Or now.
Or now. Is it my turn? Your turn?
Now.
Yeah, it's now.
You go. You're doing so good.
Oh, stop. So MacArthur, at this point, when China gets involved, he calls for war with China, and Truman, again, as the president, he doesn't get to decide that, but he doesn't want that at all. And again, if MacArthur, if we declare war against China and declare war against North Korea, then MacArthur would be able to use all of the U.S. military.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, he's only fighting with UN forces, which are really pale in comparison to the entire might of the U.S. Army. So that's kind of why he wants to get involved. Again, Truman doesn't want that.
Truman knows that we would, well, he's pretty sure that we would lose if we went to war with China while still trying to fight the Soviet Union. Plus, the Soviet Union and China have this mutual assistance pact. So.
And again, the other thing that we haven't talked about is that we now live in a world with nuclear weapons, and like that's part of the reason why like China and the Soviet Union are kind of hesitant to engage here, because they don't know really what to expect from the United States. Like, will they use the atomic bomb again? Like, if we declare all-out war. So we're in a different world now, and that's part of the problem. And that's kind of why this is so complicated. Anyway, so the United Nations and South Korea retake Seoul. They advance north to the 38th parallel, which is, again, where we all started. And they're really worried about starting World War III if the Soviet Union and China get involved. So MacArthur continues to push for the invasion of China. He actually came back to America for a little bit, and he started criticizing Truman like crazy, spoke to a bunch of newspapers, magazine publishers. He spoke to Republican leaders in Congress as well, all kind of pushing for them to support him rather than Truman. And Truman's like, well, I'm the president, and you work for me, so now you no longer work for me. So he fired him on April 11th, 1951. And again, MacArthur is a war hero. Like, this guy was one of the most popular generals that we have had. He was actually, although he was in charge of the bonus army incident. Ugh. Anyway, blast from the past.
So was Eisenhower, and he becomes president.
Anyway. No, Eisenhower was second in command. I don't want to fight with you. Okay, so again, the public's going to be outraged over this hero's dismissal. Again, when he returned, even though he had gotten fired, they still threw him a parade. And then a congressional committee investigation concluded that Truman was right to fire MacArthur because, war would be bad.
War would be bad. War bad.
War equals bad.
All right, so in 1951, we're just going to give you a little bit of the end of this. In 1951, the Soviet Union suggests a ceasefire. This was really unexpected, but we're like, cool, okay, because we're getting tired. And again, it's just going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and nobody's really making any headway here. And that might be why they suggested the ceasefire, because it's just wasting resources at this point. In 1953, we signed an armistice. Korea is still divided at the end of this armistice. There's a demilitarized zone established, which you saw on the map a couple of slides back. With the lack of success, high human and financial costs, Truman is obviously out, and Eisenhower is elected. As president, containment had held communism back without nuclear weapons, but it really wasn't super successful in the sense that Korea is still split in two. And so the U.S. begins to station more troops in Asia to deter the spread of communism and to stop that domino theory, which we talked about earlier.
And again, this is like really the first unsuccessful attempt. Like, we weren't really involved with China, like we were financially, but not militarily or anything like that. So this is really the first example of a failure. And maybe some people might not call it that, but again, it's just good to know that we were involved and we were not successful in containing communism here. So again, Korea still divided to this day, and that's how the war ended in a stalemate.
Good stuff.
So nice. Thanks for hanging out today, guys. See you in the next one.
Bye, guys.